We come then to the brow setup on this fella, and you can see we've already put an awful lot of it in. Again, fear not, this is identical to what we did in the simple rig. Let me just give you a recap. We have a spline along here, that's this chain of nulls, right? So that's a spline that defines the arch over the brow there. Upon that, we have a bunch of track nulls that are just spacing out along that spline, and then we have a bunch of bones, each of which is a single scale bone going between the tracking items. This arch brow then, each of the control points of that spline has itself a spline control, which is here in the forehead, and so we have all of these splines going up the forehead, mapping out the shape of the skull. And quite simply, all that we do is use an expression to set the base positions for where those points are on each of their respective splines, and then we just add on the position of a master controller plus, of course, individual point controllers there for each one like that. So as the whole spline's points can each slide up and down those splines. A couple of small differences that we've made here. First of all is we've got 4 points along the brow here rather than 3, plus of course the centre. You see also that this spline I have extended right down to the eye side corner position here. So we've got a bone that's stretching in there. But that doesn't move based on one of the brow controllers. Rather, that actual spline end knot has as its position item a little control here. So we can just get, small scale adjustments there. Obviously, this wouldn't be a controller that you're aiming to pose big time. That's just for, little subtleties of nuanced motion that you can put in at the side there. To help with that, we've also got this, a temple bone, which is just stuck there, along the temple, and basically is just to handle the geometry in this region so as it can reach for that same point and be adjusted appropriately like this. Very similar to what we had going on in the cheek. Here I've only used the one bone. You might, for instance, use a little fan or a little triangle of bones, coming from a little further up the side of the forehead here and a little down into the cheek if you desired. Usually it's not necessary, but with some characters or some topologies it may be. We can also see over here on the nose bridge area, we've added in a couple of little bones, which are again just single stretch bones that go for the points on the spline there, and that way as the brow is going up and most of all coming down, we get that little stretch over the nose bridge area that holds that geo for us. It gives us that nice little shaping going on there. And we see that we've created these individual weight maps for those areas to section them off. So we've got this one here for, the nose bridge, which is nice and soft. We have a map for the temple region there, just for that singular bone, which again, as you can see, is very softly blended into the surrounding area. We have the weight map of the main brows themselves, which as you can see overlaps slightly with where the temple is and where the nose bridge is, to again allow the bones influences to, blend with one another. And then of course we have a forehead map to deal with the forehead region up here, which in this case you can see extends right up to the top of the skull and the scalp. And it's this that I want to talk about specifically here now. Obviously, we've got these forehead bones exactly as we had on the, simpler version of the bone rig. So they just, go to the appropriate points on the brow and, squash like that. So it's when we raise our eyebrow, we get a squashed, forehead. However, what you will notice happens when you raise your eyebrows is that your forehead doesn't simply move up, your hairline also moves down. In fact, it varies a little from person to person, but for most of us, if you put your hand here right on the crown at the, the turn of the back of your head, and you raise your eyebrows, you can feel the scalp move forward. When we operate our eyebrows, when we pull using the frontalis muscle, the entire scalp, or a good large portion of it, does also slide over the skull ever so slightly. What you'll find is that there's a sort of a line just around the mid-forehead that's largely static, and the forehead skin between the eyebrow and that line ruffles up, whereas the forehead and scalp skin above that line pulls downwards. Now, how far over the back of the head you want to extend this is of course up to you. You just extend the splines. You can see that the splines that we have here are running right up to the top of the scalp there. You can run them right further back if you so desire, and obviously put in the necessary bones. A lot of the time that's probably going to be unnecessary, since of course we are dealing with animated characters who will be appearing on screen, and if you're looking at their face and seeing their eyebrows raising, you can't see the backs of their heads moving as well. But having that little adjustment where the hairline can dip down, that can offer a good sense of added realism into our character faces. So the way that we've done that is with these bones here. This is most easily viewed from the side, and what you can see is that as the brow and the first part of the forehead is stretching upwards, this bit is stretching downwards like that in order to help pull our scalp and hairline down. Again, it's using the same spline. So let me just show you how we've gone about setting this up. The first thing that we need is a null somewhere that will track along the spline, and here it is. I've just called this the forehead track M because this is for the middle line. So let's create a new null, the forehead track 1 left. Make it a child here of the forehead root. Again, this is just a null root I've put in to put all of these forehead, spline and whatever items underneath. And what do we want for this? Well, we want it to have a spline control, right? So let's just store the assignee. In this case, the spline that it's going to go on is this one, the forehead S1, spline 1, left. Okay, so we'll just set that to be the spline. Let's just reset the scaling of that null there. And let's just put its default position at 0 on Z. And of course, you can see that as we rattle it up the Z, along it goes up the spline. Now, where we want it to start, of course, with the brows, we initially put them at 0 and then we found an appropriate place here that was in line with the brow arch. This one, we want to start it all the way at the top of the spline. Okay, so let's find out what value that is. In this case, 980 millimeters, or close enough. So let's open up the graph editor for this fellow, create an expression for him. So this is the forehead track left and it's the forehead 1. So it's 0.98, 980 millimeters, right? Now we want it to work in response to both the main brow controller that we've got here and of course the individual controller at that particular point of the brow. So it's 980 millimeters minus the brow 1L position Y, which is of course this here, minus the brow left main position Y, which is this main controller's Y position here. So we get the position Z, we apply that, and we can see then that as this goes up, it comes down. Also, as this goes up, it comes down more. Now you might say, well, hang on, that means that when this goes down, that runs backwards. And that's true, it does. But again, feel your own scalp or feel your hairline, and when your brow pushes down, it often has the effect of pushing back up. Do you have to have that? Could you make it so as it stops? Certainly. You could just wrap a clamp around this to prevent it going beyond 980 millimeters. So once we have that track null in place, we then just add the bones, and you can see we've got a brow root that's got all of our little, brow stretchies underneath it. We've got a forehead root that's got all of our, forehead bones here, and I've also got the scalp bones underneath that. So we'll just add another one. So this is the scalp 1 underscore left. Let's do store assignee. Go to the forehead track 1 null that we just created, set pos item and world position. We've still got that stored as our assignee. So now let's just pick this bone here, right? We don't have a null somewhere on the spline at that position, but we've got this bone, so let's just set it as the target. We can keyframe that. Of course, it needs a tip, so scalp one tip, store it as our assignee, grab that bone, set it as the goal, do our good old set the Z position to IK and key it, put it back to keyframes, get the parent bone, set its rest length, and of course set its scale to IK. We give it the forehead weight map, so there we have that, and obviously the tip child there is just nothing. Consequently, we now have that bone that comes down the scalp there. If you wonder why it's moving so much faster than this one over here, remember this is the mid. The mid is going to be halfway between the left and right controllers. If we look at the expression for the mid null there, you see that it's the brow mid controller minus half of the brow main left. Once we've created the right side, we stick on that minus half of the brow main right. Then as both the left and right come up together, this will come down just as much as that. If you wanted to stagger it off further, so as you had, a bit more of an even blend, and you can do that, you could perhaps set this to follow the brow main left by, let's say, 2/3, and the brow main right by 1/3. And then by the time we got to this line over here, we would do it 100% of the brow main left. That way these bones would gradually tip off as they came further away from the centre line. They would be influenced less by the opposing side. That's something I'll leave to your own discovery and deliberation. In the meantime, what we do need to do is add in one more bone, because you can see that I have this fixed bone here that is just running from the very top point, so somewhere behind the hairline, and coming down to wherever it is we expect the hairline to be. So under the forehead root, we'll add another bone. So this is the 1B underscore left. So of course I'm saying scalp 1, meaning line 1, line 2. So we can pop that in, and in side view, let's find appropriate place for it. And just look around there to judge the depth. I think that looks pretty good. We'll give it its tip, come back to it, stored assignee, get this bone which is moving, or the null, either or. For the sake of properness, it's probably better to choose the null. Set that to be its target item, come to the tip, stored assignee, get that null again, set it to be the goal, bring the tip out to the correct position and key it, get the parent bone there, rest length it, and of course give it its appropriate weighting. And so there you can see we get these scalp bones that help us to pull our hairline as the brow is pulled up. We get this bi-directional stretching going on in our brows, just like this. So once you have that all set up for all of the lines there, you'll have your fully functioning scalp and brow, and you might discover or think to yourself on reflection, as I have, that perhaps having the scalp come down as much as the brow is coming up, right, millimetre for millimetre, is a little bit excessive. And in fact, again, if you look at real life, if you look at real faces, you will find that although the hairline and the scalp does pull down, it doesn't pull down as much as the brow is pulling up. And it's easy enough to tweak. As you can see, what I've done here is I've just taken, the brow controller and the brow main controller, Y positions in each of the expressions, and I've just divided their values by 3. So now the scalp pulls down 1/3 the amount that the brow is pushing up. And so we still get that nice subtle effect without it looking too crazy. There remains then one main area of the major deformation of our eyebrow area that we have yet to deal with, and that's the underbrow area, above the eye and below the eyebrow. As you can see, of course, at present, when I pull my eyebrow up, this is stretching out in between there, and it's broadly okay, but of course that's not what the eyebrow does. It doesn't just pull back like this. Essentially, this skin here is collapsing into somewhere, but the problem, of course, is that that's not how a real face is made. Under here you have a skull, And the reason that the brow protrudes like this is yes, it does have, a little deposit of fat along the brow there, but you've also got the brow ridge of the skull itself. More pronounced in some individuals than others, but given this guy has, quite pronounced eyebrows there, we presume he has a bit of a pronounced brow ridge to his skull. And of course, if you watch what the eyebrow does as it comes up, it doesn't just lift up, it rolls over that ridge of bone. And so we've got to find a way of handling that and getting the deformation to flow down properly to the upper eyelid. Now we might think that we can just use more of these stretchy bones like we've used, in the nose bridge there, right? To just, put a little stretch across here. But of course all that happens is, as the brow goes backwards, which it is doing because the forehead slopes backwards, those bones are just going to tip back, and so this area is going to continue to sink in. That's clearly not going to fix it. So what can we do? Well, the first stage is careful weighting around the brow, and especially in this under area, nice smoothing. Watch, where the edges extend to, so as you get a nice smooth deformation to begin with. And of course, as always, that's worth investigating at subpatch level 0, and we can see what is happening here on account of that. Yeah, it's just pulling at that row, and the reason that we're getting that stretch in between is just the subdivision taking effect. But that aside, we've got a, pretty good deformation taking place in there. It's a good place to start. What else might we think of to try and, handle this? Well, I suppose we could consider a morph, right? We could try and morph these points to sort of shape them out. But you've got the problem that the bones are travelling along this spline, and you're trying to make this morph that rotates points around. And of course, because morphs are linear, you can't produce a rotary motion from them. You could try a series of morphs that trigger in sequence. That's starting to get very complicated. And of course, you've also got the issue that it's not just one movement for the brow. You've got it happening at all these different points along the length of the brow. That also makes it tough. Fortunately, what we do have is something that's already here, and that's the brow bones themselves. For instance, even though they're scaling on their Z, we can still scale them in their X and Y axes. So that lets us reshape the flesh. And as well, even though they're targeting to one another, they still have bank rotation available, which at present we hook up to our, brow controllers here, so as we can get individual animation control like that. The same, of course, being true of our scaling. And this is likely to give us the best results overall, is to pose our brow with a bit of rotation and some scaling, so that as it moves up, it also rolls, stretches to pick out that shape of the brow ridge beneath. It would of course be really rather handy if we didn't have to do this at every brow point when posing the brow, every single time we want to move it. And so although we still really do want to keep that controllability for ourselves, it would be nice to have some automation. As such, if we've already taken any control over, the bank or the X and Y scale as a constraint or somewhat, it's best to get rid of that. And we'll again turn to a nodal motion. So I'm going to get an item info node here. This will be for the brow one left, which is of course the controller that matches to that bone, and another for the brow main left, because of course I want each bone to operate as a function of both the main lift and the individual controller lift. I'm looking at just the local position here, because of course these things are based at 0, and I'm taking obviously enough their Y channel. I will of course add them together to get a combination of the two, much as we did in expressions of course. This is position.y plus position.y of course. You can divide that result by 2 to get the average, whatever, it doesn't matter, it's just a number. And then we'll get a gradient to start altering some of our control. So I'm going to start by playing with the bank. Easiest way to do this is just to grab the make vector, plug that into what will be the bank channel, and plug that into rotation. And let's make sure we of course set the start 0 position to output 0. So there we are at 0 bank. Now let's see, what level are we at? 111 millimeters. So let's set to 0.111 there. And what we'll do, start twisting like this, and we can see our bone twisting in response. You can just turn that till we reach something that seems appropriate. I think that that might be quite good. 40%, of course, that converts to 0.4 radians. So whatever that is, about 30 some odd degrees. Oh no, look, 22.92. So there we go. Next, I'll get another gradient. I'm going to use this to adjust my scale. So let's get another make vector. Let's just take a quick peek and see what sort of scale parameter I might want. I'm out on the X there by, what's that, about 1.6. Out on the Y by something like, what, 1.4, I guess. Perhaps 1.4, 1.5 is a good number for each. So since this is a clone of our other gradient, I can just take that there. Make sure, of course, that at the start, 0, we're wanting scale 1. So let's set that to 100, 100% scale. And then let's set this alpha output to 150% scale. Let's plug it up to both our X and our Y. Plug that into scaling. Right, let's just reset that, and we can then see the effect taking place on that one bone. Perhaps we should only pull that effect in when we get significantly higher. So where are we? 0.165. Change the value there in our gradient. Because of course you could see when I was pulling it up, it was starting to come on quite swiftly. So there we go, that's gentler now. You see that stretching out as we go up. Now we said we also wanted the individual control, didn't we? So there's our item info for the brow one left. Let's get a vector add node. Let's get the rotation and add it to the rotation that we're calculating there. Plug that into rotate. And let's do the same for scaling. Plug that in there, add it to the scaling we've calculated, and plug that into scaling. Now, then of course our bone blows up. Why is it doing that? Because of course we're adding scaling, aren't we? We're adding 1 to 1, so it goes up to scale 2. It's not an add node that we want. What we actually want is a multiply node, because then it will be, 1 times 1, which is of course 1, or 1 times a half, which is a half. So we plug that in there, and thus you can see we have still manual control of the bank plus manual control of the XY scaling. We paste that, of course, to the other things there, picking up the additional controllers, or should I say swapping the item info to look at the appropriate controller, right up to number 4 there. Good. Then we can see how that effect looks. Ah, there we go. Now we're getting something that's working out much nicer. We can see, of course, that the same settings that we used on one bone isn't quite appropriate for all of them. So we can tweak some of these down, so as we're getting a less pronounced effect. Perhaps for some of them, actually shrinking the bone on its scale is appropriate. So with that done, let's have ourselves a little look in Subpatch. And I think that what we're getting there is something quite nice and much better than what we had going on before.